Let's get you all the details of our top story at this hour. In what proves to be a critical juncture in the George Floyd case, the murder trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, accused of killing George Floyd, is all set to begin today. The jurors will be hearing the opening arguments in the trial of the ex-cop Derek Chauvin, who stands accused of murdering an unarmed black man named George Floyd. 15 jurors have been selected for the high-profile trial, which is supposed to last for a month. The panel seated after 2 weeks of jury selection is racially mixed. 6 white women, 3 black men, 3 white men, 2 mixed-race women and 1 black woman. The defense team will try to focus the jury on the fact that opioid fentanyl was found in Floyd's system, trying to prove that he had some underlying health conditions. The official autopsy concluded that Floyd's death was homicide. Keith Ellison, the prominent Minnesota Attorney General, leads the prosecution team and will rely heavily on the key piece of evidence, that is the damning video which shows Floyd being pinned to the street with Chauvin kneeling on his neck and Floyd crying, "I can't breathe." Now remember, Chauvin is one of 4 cops who had arrested and subdued Floyd last May on suspicion that the 46-year-old African-American had tried to buy groceries with a counterfeit $20 bill. After the shocking video had surfaced, the cop was subsequently fired and was charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. Chauvin, on the other hand, has denied all charges against him, as he claims that he was following police procedure when he arrested Floyd. His trial will be the latest test of whether an officer accused of fatal wrongdoing will be held accountable. The most serious charge facing Chauvin right now carries a sentence of up to 15 years, and the trial is being closely watched around the world, as police officers are rarely convicted in the United States when charges are brought against them. The case is considered to be one of the most significant police brutality trials in the history of the United States, as it spurred a global movement. Floyd was a spark that set the U.S. ablaze. Thousands of Americans took to the streets, and the movement spread to different cities across the world even. Millions since then have taken part in the collective resistance against racism and police brutality. For more on this story, we are now being joined by our correspondent Sarah Walton from New York. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us. Now, the murder trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, accused of killing George Floyd, is all set to begin today. This case in many ways has mobilized people to speak out against police brutality and was the impetus behind the Black Lives Matter movement. So tell us more about the mood in the country and what is expected from this trial.
Well, you know, it is feeling quite tense, actually. Certainly the city of Minneapolis, where George Floyd died and where this trial is going to be happening, has increased security. There are barriers that have gone up around places like where the courthouse is. There are private businesses that have been boarding up their windows or choosing to close down for a week because although there are peaceful rallies planned for the city while the trial is taking place, the concern is that similar to as we saw with the protests that happened soon after George Floyd's death, that as well as the peaceful element, it will also attract a violent element. And so there are nerves about that. But yes, I mean, as you've been saying, just huge amounts of interest in this case and what it means for the wider issue of police brutality in the US.
Right. Now, how likely is it at this point that Derek Chauvin will get convicted, and what kind of punishment will be meted out to him?
Well, of the charges he faces, the most serious charge could bring him a sentence of up to 40 years in prison. There is going to be huge amounts of focus on this case because civil rights leaders have long argued that police officers have not been fully held accountable for brutality, particularly against the African American community. And this case, although the evidence presented in court will be very narrowly focused on this case, it does come against this wider context. But people will be looking to see if it is possible to get a conviction against a police officer when you have such shocking evidence as the video that we saw just a few minutes ago. Right. Shocking evidence that on the face of it is very hard to argue against.
Right. My final question for you, Sarah, is there any expectation, as you just pointed out, of chaos or violence on the streets ahead of the trial, and has security been beefed up, especially in Minneapolis?
Yes, it definitely been beefed up, and I think across the country security forces will be, keeping an eye out for what I'm sure will be protests in many parts of the country, like we saw, last summer. There are precautions being taken by private businesses and by public buildings in the area. But, the security forces are prepared for it this time. There was an element when the protests started in the summer that people weren't quite expecting there to be the kind of rioting and looting that happened in some small pockets. This time round, we know that in Minneapolis, they are planning to gradually increase the presence of police on the streets and also the National Guard to try and stop any problems starting before they begin.
Right. All right, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on WION this morning, and thank you for all your inputs.